Hello and welcome to India's World. Control of the South China Sea is the most contentious and explosive diplomatic issue in East Asia, with China asserting sovereignty over maritime areas that span 3.5 million square kilometers but are also claimed by Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines and Japan. The US has become deeply involved in disputes, backing those against China and conducting military patrols. Against this backdrop, the Permanent Court of Arbitration (PCA) in The Hague has ruled in favor of the Philippines in a case on the disputed waters of the South China Sea. The decision came in an arbitration case brought by the Republic of the Philippines against the People's Republic of China concerning Chinese activities and claims in the area. The tribunal in Hague has ruled that the rocky outcrops in the South China Sea claimed by China, some of which are exposed only at low tide, cannot be used as the basis of territorial claims. I beg your pardon. It also found that China has violated the sovereign rights of the Philippines in the South China Sea by interfering with its fishing, petroleum exploration, and by constructing artificial islands. China has rejected the ruling of the Hague Tribunal, and now it remains to be seen how it would act, smarting under this international humiliation. To discuss the options before China in the wake of the Hague ruling, we have with us three distinguished experts. We have with us Ambassador TCA Rangachari, a distinguished fellow of the Vivekananda International Foundation. He's been India's ambassador to France and Germany. He was also Secretary East, looking after China and East Asia in the Ministry of External Affairs. We have with us Commodore Uday Bhaskar, a retired Commodore of the Indian Navy. He's one of the leading experts in India on security and strategic affairs. And we have with us Professor Alka Acharya, Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies. She's also a professor at the Center for East Asian Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ranga, let me begin with you. Although the Hague Tribunal's ruling is not legally enforceable, why is the ruling still being seen as a major setback for China?
Well, first of all, insofar as the treaty is concerned, and both Philippines and China are parties to it, any award that is given by them, first of all, amplifies the law in terms of disputes that have been brought before the, under the law before the PCA. And secondly, it also clarifies the legal position in regard to similar issues that may arise elsewhere in the world. That is the importance of the PCA award. Now, insofar as China is concerned, if you look at it in a very broad perspective, China is today the second largest economy in the world. It has aspirations, you see repeated reference to the China dream and so on of Xi Jinping, that it wants to play a much more important role. Xi Jinping is also on record saying that he wants to bring about a change, that China wants to bring about a change in the international order, but in a way in which not to overthrow it, but to adjust it. Now, the core and the basis of this international order is law, rule of law. If everybody is going to follow whatever is convenient to him or to that country, then we cannot really have an international order. More likely we'll have an international disorder. Therefore, what China does becomes very important.
Okay. Commodore Uday Bhaskar, in view of what Ambassador Acharya said, Rangachari said, since China has declared that it's not going to cease and desist from its activities in the South China Sea, how on earth will it blunt the impact of the ruling and avoid further erosion of its international credibility?
Well, as of now, I think the whole world is trying to see how China is going to respond in terms of rejecting or the defiance that it has demonstrated. Already there has been one announcement suggesting that they might declare an ADIZ, which is an Air Defense Identification Zone, which I think could be challenged by other regional stakeholders. Australia is the first that has said that they would not be very comfortable with an ADIZ. The second action that China could possibly take is that if the Philippines and the other countries that also have seen this as quote-unquote traditional fishing grounds, we could have a situation where there might be some bumping, meaning that either the Chinese Coast Guard, I don't think they'll use the Chinese Navy, or the so-called private militia. Today, China has a number of boats that act as militia, that they could perhaps physically prevent, whether it's the Philippines or the Vietnam or whoever. I think that could also be a very tense situation.
No, you're telling me about how they would react in the South China Sea. I'm saying what Ranga said was that it's a question of whether you want to run and reform the international order or do you want to create disorder. Now, they're being, by rejecting an international arbitration judgment, they're not building about new order.
No,
they're
no,
not
far
even
from it.
reforming
I
it.
think specific to the maritime domain, they are creating an unprecedented situation whereby they are trying to introduce certain quote-unquote principles which are not valid, which is to extend territoriality into the maritime domain is a non-starter. And if there's one thing that I would say the Hague ruling has done, it has brought enormous clarity into this whole concept of the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone, and that exclusive economic zone is not exclusionary, which is what the Chinese interpretation seems to be. So I think on the maritime domain, China is out on a limb.
Alka, to what extent is Chinese belligerence in this matter dictated by domestic considerations and the fact that the 19th Party Congress is in the offing in this autumn?
At this point, I would not bring the domestic factor as shaping the way China has positioned itself on the dispute, because this is something that they have been consistently arguing for the last decade now. It's yes, the way they respond might be with an eye to nationalist kind of sentiments that will arise. I think their reaction has to be seen from two main perspectives. The first is that, of course, the symbolic value of being perceived as a country which is on the wrong side of the law. And that is something that has hit them hard, because they are the ones who, as you was just mentioned, they're trying to talk in terms of a norm-based world, new norms and so on. But the second and more important point is that for the last 5 years plus, they have consistently been arguing about building very strong neighborly partnerships in the region, resolving its disputes bilaterally, creating a new regional architecture. And so this hits their image of one which is trying to do win-win things for the entire neighborhood. And I think that's their position, therefore, is that if we have to move in the direction of a collective security system, then this anarchic kind of a situation whereby laws which are not accepted by very significant powers should not be binding on us as well. Okay. I think it's...
You wanted to say something, Ranga?
No, just that, insofar as treaties are concerned, international treaties are concerned, the Chinese had the option, as everybody had, not to sign the treaty. Having signed the treaty, you indicate that you're willing to accept the provisions of the treaty. In fact, the Chinese signed the treaty in 1995. Before that, in 1992, they had passed the legislation regarding the territoriality, and then 1996 on the EEZ. They did not file this bit about not accepting the dispute resolution mechanism till 2006, by which time this issue of the South China Sea had also come up. Yeah. Now, in that sense, this is a legacy issue for Xi Jinping, yeah, because it predates him. Yeah. And in this present context, because he himself has taken a stand saying that we won't accept it, etc., it becomes very difficult for people down the line to go against that position.
Okay, we're going to discuss what are the options before him in the next segment, but we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with you in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go. Welcome back. We're discussing Chinese options in the wake of the Hague ruling on South China Sea. Alka, could China, for example, instead of continuing to take this hardline position, try and buy off Manila through aid, investment, promises of better trade terms, and suggest that the issue be resolved bilaterally through dialogue? Now, this may not impact, or this will not impact the ruling in any way, but it's a big face saver for the Chinese, who, as you said, they want to put up a new architecture in that region. And in any case, the case before the Hague Tribunal was taken by the previous Philippine government. The new government may be more amenable to this dialogue, or do you think domestic sentiment will prevent it from doing that?
No, I think there has been a very interesting dynamic going on between Duterte's regime and Xi Jinping. And if you follow the Sino-Philippine dialogues predating this judgment, and of course since Duterte came, there has been a very strong emphasis on resolving problems bilaterally. This is a constant refrain. Yes, the One Belt, One Road, Maritime Silk Road is going to be now offered to Manila as well. So I would be very surprised if the Chinese were not reaching out in very, very systematic and very strong ways to putting across, as you said, a face saver, but more than a face saver, to show that they can actually push the dialogue mechanism and resolving it, negotiate. And even with Vietnam, for instance, or with other countries. So you can see that their diplomacy has gone into active mode to offset some of the impact in the region itself.
Commodore, suppose they don't do this, they don't look for a face saver in the manner that Alka is suggesting. Is it possible that China would instead opt for a high-risk strategy of escalating the dispute in South China Sea to show its people in the world that despite the efforts of the US to counter its move in the South China Sea and despite the Hague Tribunal's ruling, it can do what it wants, irrespective of the diplomatic and international consequences, because it's a superpower?
Well, I think first of all, the superpower bit is still a question mark. And I think currently the response from China might be to test the waters. Because if you see in the last 2 or 3 days, the articulation particularly from Vice Minister Liu, on one hand, as I said, he spoke about the ADIZ and also said that we will take any responses that we deem appropriate to defend our sovereignty and territoriality. The Chinese Defense Ministry website has also said much the same thing. But they are also exploring, I think, the equivalent of the conciliatory kind of thing, and also trying to get a sense about how many countries will challenge. I think the ADIZ is going to be the first litmus, meaning that if they declare that and 5 countries, either individually or in tandem, decide that they will actually fly through without accepting the ADIZ, then China will lose even more face. And I think these are the kind of calculations that are going on, because all kinds of options have been considered, including, hypothetically, that a flotilla of warships of quote-unquote like-minded countries who want to uphold the principle of law will sail through. Now, these are, I would say, steadily escalatory, and one hopes that it does not reach that particular point. But China, I think, is now testing the waters about how much to push.
Ranga, Commodore Uday Bhaskar is talking of escalation also by the other affected parties, because that flotilla will be of those countries coming together. But what are the ways in which China could test the waters by not escalating it too much, yet asserting its rights? For example, by sending its Coast Guard, as was suggested earlier, by sending its fishing vessels there, this AIDZ declaration, as they did in the East China Sea with Senkaku and claimed by Japan.
See, earlier this week there was a white paper which was released by the Chinese. There are 2 points which are relevant for this discussion. First of all, that China has said that, for a long time we have been saying, and they have referred to the previous ASEAN declarations, etc., with China, they should be continuing discussion, consensus should be evolved and so on. And this is the method that they are advocating, that instead of going to the PCA, the Philippines should have continued with this process of dialogue. The problem, and this is the second point, the problem that arises in this is, in that same white paper, they say that Deng Xiaoping had said, sovereignty belongs to China, do not agitate the issue, develop cooperative relations. Now, if sovereignty is accepted by Chinese sovereignty is accepted by the others, where is the issue? There is no issue. Yeah. That is the crux of the problem. Now, if China says you once accept sovereignty, then whether it is in the framework of this one belt, one road, or otherwise investments, economic cooperation, whatever, etc. Yeah. The problem doesn't go away if the Philippines refuses to accept sovereignty, which is the case today. In regard to the second thing that you asked about, like-minded countries and so on, I would be very surprised if, having got the verdict that the PCA has awarded Philippines, they would want to give up on the sovereignty issue, and whether the others who are helping Philippines would want Philippines to give that, because this affects not just Philippines, but it affects all the other claimants in the area. Perhaps a solution that should be looked at is to keep sovereignty aside, as has been done in the case of, for example, the Danube River Water Authority, or in the case of the North Sea, oil exploration, etc., where you say, irrespective of sovereignty, we will have some kind of a profit sharing or revenue sharing model for exploiting the resources. That might fly. But if sovereignty becomes the basis for all this, then I think it is going to be very difficult.
Okay. Alka, you know China very well, you go there quite often. Is it possible that the Chinese will choose to do nothing except loudly denounce the Hague ruling and talk about sovereignty, etc., and wait for the dust to settle? Do nothing on the ground. Don't de-escalate, don't escalate. And this strategy may actually go very well for them, because domestically you would have served the nationalist sentiment, nationalist fervor will be up. At the same time, you would avoid direct conflict with the United States, which is backing all those countries which are challenging your claim.
Highly unlikely. I do not think that the Chinese today are just going to sit, just make loud noises and do nothing. I have, there are 2 or 3 options which are upping the ante, as it were. Those could be put on the side, as it were, as options. But my thinking is that the Chinese are looking and reading the tea leaves within ASEAN and the region far more closely. And for them, the major problem is going to be within the region. ASEAN is already divided on the issue. They are talking to Manila. See, the broad context in which this is happening, one must not forget, is the strategic contest between the US and China. And the Chinese are now realizing that this is going to be where the big game is. So without challenging them directly, what they are trying to do is seeing how they can bring views within ASEAN, within the region, on their side. Build, because let's not also forget, Xi Jinping's great One Belt, One Road is also at stake. So we can't have the Chinese really taking up a position which will either damage their interests in this regard or see them as buckling under the US pressure. So it's going to be about both engaging actively, but also taking a principled position, because they're very fond of taking principled positions.
But a principled position which is not based on international principles, but on domestically defined principles of sovereignty.
No, I think if you look at the way they are behaving, they're behaving very much like the United States is. And I think that's where the, the crux is.
Okay, we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go. Welcome back. We're discussing the options before China in the wake of the Hague ruling on South China Sea. Ranga, we've discussed how China may respond, may not respond. But how will the US be challenged by China's response? I mean, they have the 7th Fleet deployed in Asia. They play an important role in assuring freedom of navigation in this area. How far will the US go in reacting to China when it is confronted by an aggrieved China and a China that is more, is forced to become aggressive because it's been put into a corner?
Well, I think one basic thing we have to remember is that the Americans and the Chinese have far too complex and intricate an engagement between themselves for either of them to push things to a breaking point. So if there is to be a solution which has to be found, the Americans and the Chinese will find a solution between themselves. Maybe one won't know about it at such time as they have arrived at some kind of an arrangement or agreement or whatever. But this closeness of relationship between the United States and China should not in any way be minimized. So none of us can count on the fact that it's like the US-Soviet Union kind of situation. It's not.
But
same thing
it will
operates.
still be a challenge to US to react to Chinese aggressiveness if it is escalatory, to react to Chinese diplomacy if it is more cooperative.
Within limits. You see, neither of them is going to push it to a breaking point. The other thing that is relevant here is that, we were earlier talking in terms of the Chinese wanting to behave like the United States. Now, first of all, in the specific context of the UNCLOS, United States is not a signatory. But leave that aside. In the larger context, why the United States has been able to get away with what it has done, this unilateralism. First of all, the Chinese are highly critical of unilateralism. Yeah. Secondly, the Americans have got away because they are powerful enough. Are the Chinese powerful? This is a point that earlier Commodore Uday Bhaskar was making. So when you put a question mark on this superpower business, that is something the Chinese will need to assess. And in regard to ASEAN and so on, Xi Jinping, again, Xi Jinping has said that although, we have extremely good economic interests with various partners and so on, nobody should assume that just because we have good, close economic relations, we will give up on our core interests. Yeah. The Chinese have elevated South China Seas into a core interest. And that creates its own problems. My suspicion, or rather I should say my hope is that the Chinese, as they have indicated in the white paper, would want to continue down the path of dialogue, trying to build a consensus. Okay. But frankly, I don't know if the sovereignty issue remains on the table, how they will be able to do that.
Commodore, but let's talk of how the US would react. I mean, China we've discussed quite a lot. How will the US balance Chinese reaction in the South China Sea and confronting China in the South China Sea, while seeking its cooperation on other international issues, nuclear proliferation, North Korea's nuclear arsenal, reducing it, climate change, global trade, dealing with pandemics. Because you need Chinese cooperation as well as you need to contain China in a manner that other smaller countries are not affected.
Well, I think both China and the United States are in their own way aware of what in the jargon often refers to as the contradictory compulsion of the globalization that we see in the early 21st century. And I think Ranga's point is absolutely right, that the trade, economic and fiscal domain, they are so enmeshed that neither side can really de-link from the other. And in some other forum, we had said that Czechit or China exiting from any aspect of globalization, the lattice of globalization, is not an option unless they are willing to sustain very heavy costs. So at this stage, I think the United States, again, to my mind, will uphold the FON, the freedom of navigation. Because what China is trying to do is that it is trying to extend a concept which, as I said earlier, is invalid, which is that of establishing or claiming territoriality in the maritime domain, which is a non-starter. So I think what the Hague judgment has done is to clarify a number of aspects about management at sea. And I think the US is unlikely because it also has a larger East Asian security architecture to look at, all the way from Japan right down to ASEAN. So I think, and I'm saying this tentatively, China may have painted itself into a corner. And we have to see how they'll have a soft landing.
Okay. Alka, this Hague ruling will have, of course, a long-term impact on China's South China Sea policy. But how might it impact China's calculations in other disputed territories, for example, in the East China Sea with Japan?
Look, again, I think the Chinese emphasis has consistently been to resolve these issues bilaterally. Now, one aspect of this Hague ruling is that the move in the direction of taking your disputes for arbitration, if you are not able to resolve them, is being challenged by the fact that these rules are not universally and either acknowledged or are legally enforceable. You can have a verdict which can specify the legal position, but they are not enforceable. So this, this weakness in terms of the laws that govern questions of sovereignty and so on, we have a long way to go before we can actually reach that point. So I don't think that the Chinese emphasis on bilateral negotiations and mutual accommodation and adjustment as a strategy for resolving disputes is going to be changed. They are also stressing a lot on the fact that the Philippines never exhausted the political methods to resolve the dispute, but took the matter to the Hague. So that is something that they are trying to convince the smaller states with which they have other disputes.
Ranga, some analysts have tried to draw some bigger conclusions from what's happening in the South China Sea and the Chinese reaction to it. They say that this will reinforce the perception of hardline people all over the world, from Moscow to Beijing, that the current international system and its legal infrastructure is created by the United States and its allies, and that it favors them. It needs a complete overhaul. So it's all right to defy it and say that we will not accept its judgments because it's a system that is biased. Do you agree with this prognosis?
Well, specifically in the case of the UNCLOS, everybody, including the Chinese, were part of the negotiating process.
But the Americans who were never part of UNCLOS are taking a very active role.
No, they were part of the negotiations. But then this is not true only of UNCLOS. The Americans are not even signatory to any of the human rights conventions, although they have been part of the negotiations right through. So the fact that you have chosen to enter into a treaty commitment into which, you know, negotiation or finalization of the treaty, you were part of the negotiating process. At the end of the day, and several years down the line, I mean, 20 years after you have signed the treaty, suddenly you say, no, this treaty doesn't suit me, therefore I don't want to. Yes, you could say that. But then to say that I did it under pressure or that this treaty came under pressure, that is something which will not carry much credibility. And you do that in one instance, then the question arises, would you not do it in other instances?
Absolutely.
And that has been the basic problem. Because, you know, in this case of history, how far back do you go? And in this case itself, they say in 45, sovereignty was restored to Taiwan. No, Republic of China is an existing entity.
Well, the boundary lines were drawn by the Republic of China in the map of 1947.
So, you know, if you get into legalities, there are lots of questions that would come up. And as far as politics is concerned, as I have been saying earlier also, if sovereignty is not to be contested and everybody accepts that position, there is no problem.
Okay, but we've run out of time. I'd like to close here. I'd like to thank all my guests, Professor Alka Acharya, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Ambassador TCA Rangachari for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Until then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.